Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to SAMS. I'm Nick Owens. I'm the director of SAMS, and it's a great pleasure to be introducing and opening the first of what we hope will be many such events. It's a new sort of annual event that we're initiating here today on sort of the relationship of art and science, and it's something that I'm particularly interested in, and so it's a great pleasure to be kicking off this first one. We have a large number of people registered and attending, and I can see the numbers climbing all the time. For those of you who are joining us, well, indeed welcome. Firstly, for those of you who don't know SAMS, I mean, who are we? Well, we're a well-known, internationally recognised research institute, marine research institute on the west coast of Scotland, just outside of Oban. And we've been around for a very long time, since 1882 actually. And the origins of SAMS actually relate to the title of this event, the Wild SciArt. And our origin really is with a scientist called John Murray, who was an important scientist on the Challenger expedition, HMS Challenger expedition, which did a circumnavigation of the planet. It took 3.5 years, 150 years ago it set off. And John Murray was, and the Challenger was the first expedition to put to sea purely for scientific purposes. So very notable for that. And John Murray was a notable scientist on that expedition. And indeed, at the conclusion of the expedition, he saw through all of the reports and so on and so forth. And one of the outputs from the whole expedition was the establishment of a marine research institute, which he set up initially in Edinburgh, and eventually, long history, we ended up here in Oban. There's a direct thread between us, John Murray, and the Challenger expedition. And the artist on the Challenger expedition was John James Wild, hence the name of this particular lecture series that we're about to start. So Wild SciArt. So Wild was, not only was he a scientist, but was also an artist. And such people were very common in those days, where there was a mixture of art and science. And so we're continuing that thread. The topic that we're involved with is algae. We're very keen and interested in algae in SAMS, where we're involved in both the macroalgae, the seaweeds, but also the microalgae. We have the largest culture collection, one of the largest collections in the world, of single-celled algae. We have a couple of seaweed farms as well. And so we think it's a very appropriate starting place for this is the relationship between art and science with algae, most beautiful organisms. So not only are they beautiful to look at, they're really important. And whilst there is a big debate in geochemistry circles about this, I can say not only are they very beautiful, they actually, every second breath that you take while you're listening to this lecture will have been produced by algae, primarily from the oceans, but because of their photosynthesis, they're producing algae all the time. So not only beautiful, but also pretty important. Anyway, a particular pleasure of mine now is to introduce our chair for the rest of the afternoon, and that's Professor Juliet Brody. Juliet, thank you so much for joining us. It's a great pleasure. Juliet is an individual merit scientist at the Natural History Museum. She's an expert in algae, particularly red algae. And she says that, of course, she's got her interest not only in the organisms themselves, but also in their beauty. And she also says, and I think I agree with you here, Juliet, that it's a great time to be a scientist. It's a great privilege to be a scientist. And so I think we've got the best of both worlds today, which is what this is all about. And that is, we've got the beauty and pleasure and stimulation of art, but also with the pleasure and excitement of science. So Juliet, it's all yours.
Right, thank you very much, Nick, for that introduction, and a very warm welcome to everyone for this inaugural meeting. And it looks like it's going to be a fantastic turnout, which is brilliant. But just before I say a few words to introduce the talks, there's a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions for the speakers, or the panel, then just pop them in the Q&A, which you should be able to find at the bottom of your screen. And we'll do our best to cover at least as much as we can. We're quite tight for time, but we'll try and cover at least the main topics. And then after the meeting, you'll be sent a post survey. And if you're interested in following up in this particular initiative, then you will have that chance. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to see if, I don't know whether I can see if I can share my screen. I've just got a few slides to show you. I think you should be able to hopefully see that. I don't know if that's going to come live. Yes, there we go. Right. Okay, so as Nick said, really, it's the beauty of the seaweeds that attracted me to them. And it was very much about their colors and their shapes and their diversity of form. And for me, they've provided inspiration ever since, not only for science, but also as a means for poetry and also for music. And I was inspired to write a poem about seaweeds, and I wanted to try and capture not only the sort of colors that we see, like the blues, the reds, but also something a bit more about them in relation to that. And so I put together a poem, and then I wrote some music, and then I got my choir, who are very long-suffering and tolerant, who sang it for me. So I've always sort of seen the two together, the art and the music, the art and the science together. And what's been interesting, I think, too, is that when I started out as a scientist, which was really quite a long time ago, I'd always seen science as creative. But I felt then that art and science were really quite separate. But I've seen over the years, and this is what's really exciting, this sort of evolution where the subjects have come together. And so when I was asked if I would host a meeting bringing together the art and science and the seaweeds, I was absolutely delighted to accept. It's a very thrilling meeting. And of course, that set me thinking about what is science, what is art, what are they for? I thought about my own work, about using them to explore and educate, and about environmental change. And I was fortunate to be able to put together the exhibit in the Natural History Museum, which you can see here on the right of this slide. And I felt that this was a way that we could produce something that we could tell people about the seaweeds. We could tell them, just as Nick has said, about how important they are, how vital they are to our planet, and how remarkable they are too. And I thought about this a little bit more with some questions, and could we build something between us for a better world? Or rather, I believe we can build something between us for a better world. And I'd also like to think that something transformative and long-term might come out of this meeting. And that might be perhaps in the form of a working group, or perhaps in the longer term, some sort of joint society, or some sort of joint way of sharing information. So again, if you've got questions about that, please pop that in the chat. And so with that, we have a great lineup of speakers to tell you about their work. I'm hoping that they will perhaps answer some of my questions. And at the end, we'll have a panel where we'll be able to explore some of these ideas more broadly and look at some of the more practical elements of that. So with that, I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker. And this is Anna Dumitriu. Now, Anna is an internationally renowned British artist who uses her work to explore biology and robotics. And if you haven't had a look at her website yet, then there's really a wealth of fascinating information to find there, and a bit more about, I think, the subject she's going to talk about today. So Anna, over to you.
Thank you, Juliet. It's particularly great to be introduced by you, because I spent quite a long time stomping over the rock pools nearby here with your book in my hand, looking at the different species and trying to work out what they were and things. So initially, when I was invited to do a talk for SAMS, it was about my work with culture collections rather than with seaweed. So I'm artist in residence with the National Collection of type cultures in London, which is the oldest collection of pathogenic bacteria. And I think Mikey from the group had seen my talk for their 100th anniversary and invited me to give a talk. And so and then I said, well, actually, I've been doing a project on seaweed as well, working with Fabrica Gallery. So I'm going to talk a bit about that as well. So I'll just share my screen now. Okay, and I've given it the title BioArt Cultures and Algologies, and I'll explain the third term when we come to it, because I know it's not the right term for seaweed. Don't be upset. To all the phycologists out there. So my roles, I have lots of roles, different roles of artists in residence working with different people. So National Collection of Type Cultures at the UK Health Security Agency, Modernising Medical Microbiology and the Cryptic Project at Oxford University, working with the University of Hertfordshire, working with Brighton and Sussex Medical School, working with plant science, working with stem cells, all sorts of things, and working with the University of Surrey now with all sorts of things around zoonotic diseases. I was the, and also Boca University in Vienna, the University of Life Sciences there, and I was the 2018 president of the Science and the Arts section of the British Science Association, which is it shows I'm passionate about bringing these areas together. So to give you a bit of the background on my work, I trained in fine art, but I'm fascinated with the biological world, and particularly microbiology, particularly infectious diseases, and emerging technologies like synthetic biology, working with CRISPR, genetic modification and things like that. But this is an early work that I made with Public Health England and with the Oxford University. And it's actually MRSA bacteria grown on a chromogenic colour-changing agar that reveals if it's MRSA bacteria, this pathogenic antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And I've created patterns on it. This is just a test example to make it kind of obvious what I was doing, creating patterns using different antibiotics to control the growth of it. And I'm really interested in things like dyes, the relationship of dyes and microbiology, and working with agar, which I'm sure you all know is made from seaweed, seaweed jelly. So, and it's used across the world in microbiology labs. So this is the finished artwork. I sterilized the quilt squares and the dyes remain there. The blue areas are where the MRSA grew. And you can see the different effects of the antibiotics. And I've done other works with the Staphylococcus aureus from my body. This is a Staph aureus dress. That's a 1960 dress design that is based on the fact that MRSA first evolved then. We think it's a new thing. We think superbug infections and, you know, the things that the press talk about are new things. And it's revealing the process of genomics, the light output of a whole genome sequencer as it's sequencing the genome. But the dress is also impregnated with the Staph aureus from my body, with MRSA and with something called VRSA, which is resistant to the last ditch antibiotic, which is vancomycin that you would use. And projected behind it is the whole genome sequence, the 2.8 million base pairs of the whole genome sequence of the Staph aureus from my body, which I learned how to whole genome sequence in the lab. I grew all the bacteria. I've learned all these techniques myself working alongside scientists for about the last 20 years. So all my work's made hands-on in the lab. And it's the first bacterium ever to make it into the National Collection of Type Cultures in London, as being for its artistic importance. So this is me adding the Staph aureus that lives on me to the National Collection of Type Cultures, and I went through the whole process of actually putting the bacteria on it. Most people would send a sample of the bacteria and that gets added to the collection, but for my purposes, I wanted to do the whole process. So I learned how to grow it up, freeze dry it, and the processes that they use for recording the organism is in their collection. It's in there for 40 years, and then they would break open the vial again, reculture it, and then freeze dry it again for the next session. So this is NCTC 14139, which is the Staph aureus from my body, available to bioartists around the world if you have a category 2 lab. And these works, they make it into sort of bizarre forms of popular culture as well, so they can reach out to lots of different audiences. And there was a discussion on QI, because there was an episode on quilts, and the MRSA quilt actually made it onto QI and onto it was the quills episode. So it gets it out there to all sorts of different audiences that you might not expect when you're kind of thinking of the science behind something. Another project I did with the University of Oxford, but also with Technion in Haifa, was repairing antibiotic resistance using CRISPR DNA modification, this sort of so-called easy cut and paste way to do genetic modification. It's not easy, it takes months, and most of the people I was working with, their experiments were failing at the time, and I think mine only succeeded because I didn't follow the protocol. I tried to grow many more bacteria than would be possible because I knew I didn't have the funding as an artist to go back and try again. So what I did was I patched the genome of an ampicillin-resistant E. coli bacteria with the phrase "make, do and mend" to tell the story of the start of the antibiotic age. And the image there is different people in Oxford's gut bacteria in the Oxford Hospital grown onto cloth using these chromogenic agars. And you can see the sort of the pinks and the blue squares. These people have very undiverse gut microbiomes because they've taken a lot of antibiotics. So it makes it very explicit. And that image actually was featured on the front cover of the Centers for Disease Control's Emerging Infectious Diseases journals, which is really exciting. So I managed to create this new strain, this make, do and mend strain of the bacterium, and I used it to grow into cloth and then to patch this suit, which is a wartime women's suit from 1941. And it's stamped with the government mark Controlled Commodity 1941, which was known as the utility mark, because the government would control things like clothing, furniture, other sorts of things like that. But obviously we all know that antibiotics were not controlled in the same way. In fact, 70% of all antibiotics are used in agriculture for factory farming, things like that, intensive farming. So so they haven't been controlled in the same way. And I was really interested in kind of thinking about this and thinking about the history of that. I don't have time to go into all the intricacies of this project, but it's a complicated and long-term project. And there's the cover I was talking about. And I even went to the United Nations General Assembly in New York, and this is a very bad photo of me behind a bank of cameras, but we were showcasing this issue. It was the Global AMR Challenge, the Antibiotic Resistance Challenge. I work with plague bacteria, I work very hands-on with all sorts of different species. This is me at Porton Down in Wiltshire, looking at plague and Staph aureus growing on a petri dish. That's my hand holding the plague, and I've extracted the DNA from plague and used it in a number of artworks. This is an artwork that is about how linen used to be considered to be how we would wash and clean the body, and so we wouldn't wash our bodies, we would wash our linen once every 3 weeks or so, and that would be considered to be very pure if we did that, because you could boil it. Linen's very strong, and so this work's impregnated with 4 different types of DNA from bacterial strains which were prevalent at the time. So you've got diphtheria, tuberculosis, scarlet fever, and Yersinia pestis plague on the work. And this is my plague dress, which is impregnated with the extracted DNA of plague. It has a actual period embroidery from the time of the Great Plague of London, and it's stuffed full of lavender and turmeric and lots of spices that the doctors would use at the time. It's dyed with walnut because Samuel Culpeper, the herbalist, said that was a treatment for the plague. And there's a couple of close-ups. It's currently on show at the Boerhaave Museum in Leiden. I've done other works about tuberculosis and cutting-edge research by the scientists at Oxford University, big installations. I don't have time to really go into the details of that, but I just wanted to kind of flag it up, and then also getting people to tell their story. So this piece is called Ex Voto, and it's actually a kind of secular series of votives that tells different people's stories of infectious diseases and antibiotics, and all the ribbons are dyed with different dyes used in microbiology in the treatment of disease, or sometimes dyed with the bacteria themselves. And that's it installed last year in the Valkov Museum. So we've all been through the pandemic, as you know, and lockdown and all that, and we're all stuck where we live. And this is where I live, basically, not quite here, but about 3 minutes walk from this. It's a chalk reef, part of the Living Coast Biosphere. And so I spent a lot of time, when we were allowed to go for our health walks for an hour a day or whatever it was, walking on this beach. And I walked on it a lot. And I looked at it, and I looked in the rock pools and all sorts of things like that. And one day, I think it was about August 2020, I was like, it's so weird. Look at this red weed. I was with my partner and just noticing this stuff, and it covered the whole place. And I realized that there was the seaweed there was actually changing so much. And it hadn't really struck me until that point. So sort of from the march to the stomping over the beach. And then I started to notice this red weed covering like a kind of felted carpet, or wrapping around like threads. And that's another sort of image of the location. And lots of strange things. I think this is a Coralina. I defer to Juliet's greater expertise on everything, because I'm absolutely, I think I have massive, imposter syndrome at this point, talking about seaweed in front of all these speakers who are far more expert on it, but just about my kind of interest in it. And just looking at these, we stuck the camera in the rock pool and saw this gorgeous thing. It looks like it's set up or something, but it's not. That was just there. And I started collecting bits of seaweed and starting to look into it. And I discovered Mary Philadelphia Merrifield, who I'm sure some of you know about, if not all of you, but she lived here in Brighton and wrote a sort of a natural history of the flora and fauna in Brighton. And she was a pioneering seaweed collector. So I got a copy of her book and started to try and follow her kind of techniques. So I kind of tried to capture these in a very bad way using her techniques, but also using a microwave flower press, because, you know, I'm a modern person as well. So, and then as I started to progress with this, I found out other things. But I should say that at this point, there was awarded by Fabrica Gallery in Brighton a residency. It was a sort of remote residency where you could it wasn't actually in the gallery, because this is still during the sort of lockdown period and things like that. So nothing had really opened up then. You couldn't go and work in a space. But you could go and work in a forest or something like that. And they had this open call for artists in residence, and it was Fabrica Gallery and the Living Coast Biosphere. And so it said in the open call that it was mainly about forests, or it gave the impression it was about forests, but I didn't really live near a forest. So I thought, well, maybe if I send in an application about seaweed, I could progress this. And so I was commissioned then to take this work further through this and do a blog, which I called Algologies. Now, as I said, I know algology is not the correct name for seaweed research, it's phycology. But what I liked was this thing that it's the old name, because I used to think that if you put the word algae and the word ology together, the study of, and you would have algology, but it actually means the study of pain. And we were at such a time in the pandemic that we were, being constantly confronted with this barrage of pain. And it's kind of the time my father died, not of COVID, but of Alzheimer's. But we were going through quite a lot at the time. So this idea of like combining the kind of the serene qualities of the location of the beach with this kind of painful thing that was going on. That's why I called it algology. So it's both the study of algae and the study of pain together. So sort of playing with these ideas. And I did more research, and I found I was thinking about, could we make agar from any of these British seaweeds? So I started to research that, because obviously I work a lot with agar, and I found this thing from the Ministry of Supply, 1949, a short account of the search for British seaweed, for British use of British seaweeds in the preparation of agar, and started to try and replicate some of the experiments that they'd done, working with things like this. I think I made alginate or something rather than agar, but anyway, I was kind of boiling it up and attempting all these various kind of home kitchen remedies. And I should say as well, other things that I kind of unpacked in this story were that red weed that I showed in the beginning. The description of it is exactly like H.G. Wells' description of the red weed from Mars in the War of the Worlds. And what I found out was that he was great friends with Magnus Volk, who's a famous inventor in Brighton, who actually built a sea-going train in the sea, just off, and you can see in that beginning slide I showed you, you could see some tracks in that chalk reef there, and those tracks were the old tracks of Volk's pioneer car, his seagoing train, which was known as the Daddy Longlegs. And people have said that was the inspiration for H.G. Wells's kind of Martian vehicle. So I can imagine him visiting Brighton and talking to Magnus Volk and seeing the red weed in bloom around that time. And I think that's the inspiration for it. But it just, you can pull together all these fascinating kind of stories. So this is me boiling up this seaweed in the kitchen. And it did make a jelly, which I was able to put some silk that I stained with seaweed and used a botanical printing technique. So you kind of wrap it up and boil it. I think I've got some images of that perhaps. I tried using ultraviolet to see if I could find ultraviolet seaweed. Very, simple experiments, but I was blogging everything. It was kind of a 2-week residency. And then I did some microscopy as well. And so, because I've got quite a good microscope from the microbiology work. So I was able to do this, but it doesn't have a camera on. So I was shining my mobile phone down the lens and getting some really quite beautiful effects from trying to photograph it down the microscope. So this is some of the botanical printing. So I lay the seaweed out on silk and then kind of wrap it up and bundle it up, and then you boil it for like 3 hours, or steam it for like 3 hours. And sometimes I used some natural dyes to soak the seaweed in as well, but created these kind of silk images. As I said, this was a 2-week project, so I did so much work in it that the gallery director at Fabrica was like, Anna, you've done enough, you can stop blogging. I was like, but I've got more to say. So I was just like typing constantly through the whole period. And so these are some of the images I created there. And now, where are we at now? So I finished that residency, but still obsessed with Mary Philadelphia Merrifield. And I mean, she published a paper in Nature in the Victorian period. And I should mention that the reason women studied, I'm sure you all know this, but the reason women studied seaweed in that time, and it was a very fashionable hobby that even Queen Victoria partook in, was that the sexual reproduction of algae was very poorly understood. So it was considered that we wouldn't get aroused by it if we did it. So we can do that. So I went to the Booth Museum in Brighton, which holds a lot of Mary Philadelphia Merrifield's wonderful antique collection of seaweeds there, and photographed them. And the reason I did this, and there's some lovely ones there, is that I'm working on, with Alex May, a sculpture for Brighton Beach, a series of 3 sculptures, but one of them is focused on nature, and it will have seaweed in it. So this is just a kind of mock-up. It's got sea kale as well, which is not a seaweed, but and various things like those muddles of seaweed that you find on the beach wrapped up with twine and all sorts of things. So where you can see the sort of the seaweed images on this, we were going to be putting the Mary Philadelphia Merrifield seaweed into the sculpture, and also it will work with augmented reality. So we'll be able to have more about her amazing work and kind of reveal that, and that'll be at the Black Rock area in Brighton. So that's basically my talk, and that's how you can get in touch with me. I'm on all the different kinds of social media. So thank you for listening. I hope that was interesting and not too basic on the seaweed front, but it's been a fascinating area to be looking at. So I'll stop sharing now, and I'm happy to take questions.
So Anna, thank you very much, and for keeping to time. That's brilliant. We've got a couple of minutes for questions. There's nothing in the Q&A at the moment, but couple of things I would like to ask you. One thing I thought was fascinating when you had your pieces of material that were very plain for a microbiome that had been zapped with you know, antibiotics. And I just was thinking to myself, oh, wow, if you could use something very simple like that very quickly to test a cheap way of testing things, well, that would be amazing if art can then inform in science and so on. But so one of the questions is, you've told us a lot about your themes, really, and where we can find out a bit more about your work, particularly on your website. But so what other exhibitions have you got in mind or coming up after that?
Well, I've got a show on in Vienna at the moment on a project called Fermenting Futures, which is about yeast biotechnology. And that's at the Künstlerhaus in central Vienna, which is above the Albertina Modern. And I've got a show coming up in Wiesbaden, at the Kunsthaus Wiesbaden, at the end, at the sort of 6th, I think it opens on the 6th of April. So I've got a few things coming up in the UK. I'm in talks with a gallery in Oxford at the moment to do a solo show later in the year. So people might be able to see that in the UK.
That's brilliant. And then I've got a note here, which is, thank you so much. Your passion and curiosity is wonderfully infectious. Excuse the pun. That's from Aidan Griffin. And I think, have we got another question here? Yeah, how do you find interacting with scientists, and how do you meet, and how do you find accessing their language? I think we'll pick this up in the panel, but if you just want to say something very briefly about that.
I mean, it's fairly straightforward. It depends what subject I'm kind of engaging with. I do a lot with microbiology, and then usually these things kind of evolve and build. So, and then you meet people and chat to them, and things just sort of evolve naturally. So in terms of meeting scientists, obviously I know quite a lot already now, but quite often they approach me to talk about like developing projects and things like that. In terms of language, I'm quite good at languages, so so I usually just it's a question of like the different meanings. There's a thing they call incommensurability of language, but this occurs usually between two different scientific disciplines where they'll be using the same word and it means two different things to do two different disciplines. And so for an artist, you just have to work out what they actually mean by it. These words, complex sounding words, are just shorthand for things, and then you need to kind of reflect on where that comes from, why it's used like that, and those sorts of things. So and then also introducing artistic language into the lab, thinking about things like emotion, aesthetics, not just beauty but all the other kind of aesthetics. I mean, you know, boiling up seaweed in your kitchen is an aesthetic experience, but it's not necessarily a beautiful one. It's an interesting one. Yeah, so yeah.
So that's really fascinating. There's more questions coming in. I'm going to have to move on, but if you want to answer, you can directly to them. So there's some really nice questions coming in, but fantastic. Thank you very much, Anna, for a very inspirational talk. I think I'm going to go and boil up some bacteria now and mess about in the kitchen. But thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you for your great book that I carried with me. That's fantastic.
That's good to know. Thank you. Right. So moving on to our next speaker. And for the next speaker, we have Jessica Giannotti. Some of you may be familiar with. And she founded Krubak, which is a Scottish-based textile studio. And she uses her marine science background to spread ocean literacy through her fashion. And I'm wearing one of her scarves now. And that's called the sort of method school of hosting a meeting. And her work is increasingly gaining international recognition. So Jessica, over to you.
Thank you, Juliet. Lovely to meet you all. I'm in awe with Anne's work, so I would like to focus my talk on my practice and the business that I started based on that, which is called Krubak. Just a quick introduction to myself. I'm Venezuelan, half Italian, and came to Scotland in 2005 and started, I studied marine science here at SAMS. Started in 2006 and I never left since then. After finishing my studies, I started Krubak, and I will give you some more information about that. Before that, I used to be a show jumper and horse trainer for many years and work as a consultant in Germany as a management consultant. But I wanted to go back to my childhood dream to study marine biology. And when I found marine science here in Scotland, I realized that was my opportunity. So I did study as a mature student and my life completely changed since then. So I will just start my presentation. Okay. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, Jessica.
Okay, great. Let's move this to this side. So yes, so marine science is beautiful is the slogan that I use. And I started Krubak in 2013, and algae has played a key role in building my creative practice. Just a moment now. Okay, so Krubak is a design studio. We are based at the old teaching laboratory here at the Marine Institute at the Scottish Association for Marine Science. It was founded in 2013, and we are based here in Argyll. We are surrounded by the sea, by beautiful lochs, and of course by the SAMS, which is very important for my work because it allows me to interact with marine scientists and have access to the research. So why Krubak and why algae? Well, the first question is why not? When I was a student, I used to go to Oban and have a beer with friends. And I used to see people wearing scarves with butterflies, with flowers. And I started to wonder why no phytoplankton, why no algae, why no other things? And I think that at the time a seed was planted. And in 2007, I did a project with one of my lecturers, Dr. Claire Gachon, on algae and pathogen interactions. At the time, I had the opportunity to look down the microscope and see if the pathogen, which is called uricasma, which is a nomicide similar to fungi, under stress was able to do sexual reproduction, which at the time it wasn't understood to do so. And so I had to spend most days during my summer looking down the microscope, and then I started taking pictures, and that's when I realized, oh my God, this beautiful world is not accessible to most people. Most people will never see this, and I realized that I wanted to do something to share the beauty and to share the knowledge that I was learning. I felt privileged, and I realized I had the opportunity to do that. And then it took time, but then I realized, okay, let's do it. And then the first thought is, okay, how can I do that? How can I share this world of marine science? How can I share knowledge about the ocean? And then I realized textiles is ideal. First, I thought to become an artist. My mom's an artist, and I grew up, I trained as a painter when I was a child, but then I realized I wanted something more practical and tangible. I want people to have something in their homes that reminds them of what they learn, of the beauty. And for me also, with my business background, I realized that developing a brand, a business was the best way forward. But still, I think art is still a core aspect of my work. So I'm not focusing in art like Anne is doing. For example, Anna's work is amazing. And that is what is trickled down into society. My work is a bit below at the stage where I create a product, I create something that is inspired by marine science and the ocean, but people can buy it, and then it becomes a sustainable business model as well. But still, my designs are art-led, so I merge marine science with art and textiles, and that is the core of my business. And then I saw an opportunity as well, because now more than ever. When I started, I have to say, I was considered to be a niche business, to be a bit an outlier, and I was told by founders and different people in the Scottish government that it was strange to be focusing on marine science. But you know, looking back now, I realized that I was a bit ahead of time, and people are now more aware. Everyone is talking about climate change, plastic pollution, and consumers are really aware of fashion and the impact it has on the planet and the environment. So I think the timing is perfect. Of course, we are all worried about rising temperatures and the impact that climate change is having on our planet. And then I realized, okay, I have this opportunity to create beautiful design and spread ocean literacy by pairing the two. And how do I do that? Well, this is about knowledge sharing. So this is the key mission. And this is about people. It's not about the ocean. It's not about the planet. This is about us people, because the planet, it will be fine in the geological time scale. You know, we are just here in this moment in time. And I think for me, the mission is about sharing knowledge, working at the intersection between science and the fashion industry, and creating products, creating designs, creating knowledge that can be shared. And this is all based on collaboration. So every collection, all the work we do is developed in collaboration with marine scientists and research institutions. And we are based here in Scotland, and this is just some images of the work that we do. But it's all about collaboration, and it's all about creating designs that convey the story, the theme that we selected, and then use science images from microscopy to other research output to use as a base for creating textile designs, and then develop the products. And this is an incredible opportunity. So we developed the Gachon collection, which was the first project in collaboration with Dr. Claire Gachon. And it was about algae and pathogens interactions. And we had funding from NERC. Then we developed the Flora collection, which was about harmful algal blooms. You can have a look at the collections and also the science stories on our website in the blog. And well, this is about, for me, it's a business. It's about developing a business. And I think it is important to see that algae, you know, starting with algae, I was able to develop an idea and a brand, and now I'm moving forward to developing a business. I'm grateful to be part of a huge network of partners and collaborators and clients. And these are some of the institutions that I work with. And I'm now trying to develop a business from the consumer perspective, because as an artist, I love algae, I love talking to marine scientists, but how can I convert this idea into something that is scalable so that I can have a bigger impact on people and the environment, understanding my customers, and now measuring impact, which has to be economic, environmental, and social. So we have to be sustainable in all these ways. We have to be able to make money so that we can continue with our mission. We have to use good materials, sustainable materials, renewable materials like recycled materials and natural fibers, and also our impact on society, which is about communicating ocean literacy, inspiring people to have a deeper connection with nature, and empower people with knowledge, which I think is also very important. And it is also about the impact that we have with the materials that we use, and also the impact that we have with scientists, because they have a new outlet for communicating their work. Whereas this is just some general information about our plans for the future, and we try to use the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as a guiding tool for our work, and the future is bright. We have big plans for growth. We have plans for starting all the product ranges like the knitwear range, and work with other organizations and develop our Ocean Futures Lab to evolve from being design-led to being also material-led. So that was a very quick overview. I think I'm on time, I hope. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Jessica, thank you very much, and thank you for keeping so well to time. That's absolutely brilliant too. Questions? I've just got one in the chat at the moment, and I think it would be good. We can pick this up in the panel, but this is from Kirsten Covington, Algae UK, who is very keen on working more with artists. And perhaps when we come to the panel, you can say a little bit more about bringing artists and scientists together. So You can have a
Yes.
look at that in the chat and of course reply to her directly if you want to, but yeah.
Yes, it's very keen. It's very important to understand scientists. Scientists don't have time. You have to understand your partners to work with them. And I think it is important to be aware of the limitations, like scientists don't have time. They work under a massive amount of pressure to find funding, to write papers. So in my case, what I try to do is to be helpful, to do something that adds value to the work. It creates a new outlet, a complementary outlet. It's never to substitute traditional science communication. SAMS or all institutions I work with, they already do an amazing work in that. But through my work, I can reach new audiences, a bigger audience, and help scientists to communicate the work to these audiences, but also to highlight among colleagues. Many of the scientists I work with, they say they love wearing the scarf at conferences. Colleagues talked about the work, and colleagues within the same institution and other places, they become also more aware. So I think it's a win-win situation, but it's about being mindful of your partners around you, how they work, what the situation is, and also how to manage IP. Very important.
Thank you very much indeed for that. It's very, very inspirational. I absolutely love wearing this. It's a lovely piece of fashion to wear. So you know, it has so many different complements. So thank you, Jessica, very, very much. And we'll hopefully pick up a bit on some of those themes when we come to the panel. But it's very inspirational. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Juliet. You look lovely with your Fast 60 scarf. Thank you. Okay. Bye.
Okay, so we're moving on now to Samuel Iliff. And Samuel is a design engineer, and I think I'm right in saying he's currently a design researcher in residence at the Design Museum in London. I think that's correct, isn't it, Samuel? And your work focuses on algae and sustainable design. So very different, but really looking forward to your talk. So over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Great. Cool. And can you see the slides?
We will do in a minute. They're there. I think, yes, that's perfect.
Okay, great. Yes, so my name's Samuel and I'm a designer, so not an artist, but I'm giving my designer's perspective. And I want to talk, I have a main message, then talk briefly about my journey getting here, to talk about 2 projects that I've done that involve algae. And then I also want to talk about the kind of process that I've developed collaborating with scientists and what I would call a value exchange between designers and scientists. So my main message is that designers and scientists both address problems, but we use fundamentally different methods to do so. Through collaboration, we can achieve more than on our own. And I would like to see more collaborations between scientists and designers. So really quickly about me, what I think makes me kind of qualified to talk about this is that I began from university as a kind of engineer and scientist, working in material science, looking at graphene. And over the past 6 years, I've steadily moved towards focusing on design, but still having that kind of background. And so, yeah, as we said, I currently have a residency at the Design Museum. Algae projects. So the first one I'll talk about is called Algae Glass. This started basically with the idea that the 3 main constituent components of glass can all be found in different species of algae, along with the fact that the world is actually running out of the type of high purity quartz sand that's used to make glass. So I started off with a bit of prototyping and again, kitchen space prototyping. It turns out that you can actually fire glass in your microwave And so I was doing this at home for a while. And the end results were a kind of foamy piece of glass, which wasn't completely melted. But while I was doing this, I was collaborating with glass artists and designers. One of them called Matthew Durham and the other one, John Lewis. And we kind of came up with this process of combining the algae glass material that I was making with a standard quartz glass and using a glass blowing method. And we, the output for this was a series of objects that were created, which were a mix of the two types of glass. And I think what was really interesting with this project was that the artists that I talked to had never really thought about what they call frits, so like the beginning glass material that they use to make their objects. Yet they're also very interested and concerned about sustainability. And they really loved the idea of kind of using natural materials that potentially are more renewable. And well, yeah, not from a finite source. And so it was kind of bringing value to a new audience. Second project, very different, is called Algae Urinal. This started with a bit of kind of understanding of eutrophication in the UK especially. So talking with specialists, the insight was that phosphorus is actually the key element that determines whether eutrophication will occur in a water body. And through looking at different sources of phosphorus pollution, I found that urine was actually the single largest part in urban environments of phosphorus pollution. This got me thinking about, where can you get urine? Started looking at urinals, and then specifically urinal mats, because during this time I was also working with immobilized, it's kind of alginate, but immobilized algae in alginate, and the materiality, like the way that the two felt was actually really similar, and it felt quite natural to try and recreate these urinal mats out of this alginate. And the final outcome of that project was this was a project at the Royal Academy of Arts. So on show was one of my kind of algae mats. It was actually just a looks like prototype, because we weren't allowed to have live algae in the toilets. But it was to try and provoke some questions in the museum goers about, what happens to their kind of wee and poo when it leaves them. Where do fertilizers come from? Because these are another big source of phosphorus pollution. And thinking about climate change from a more kind of, not just through CO2, also thinking about it from the phosphorus perspective. So through these projects and through other projects I've done, I've collaborated with scientists, and I've been developing a kind of process of how I do this, although this is also developed from other people. I won't go into this too much, but basically the idea is to have an interview with scientists or experts. But before I do that, I come up with what I call sacrificial ideas, which are essentially ideas that I'm not sure will necessarily work, but that I think might provoke discussion or actually new thoughts in the expert that I'm interviewing. This can be through understanding new up-to-date information, which you can't find in papers, understanding the feeling of experts, something which really can't be conveyed well through reading papers, but when meeting these people, it becomes very obvious. And then, you know, if you're lucky, they might actually like one of these sacrificial ideas, and then you continue working with them, refining these ideas, and then kind of traditional developing prototypes and testing them. I think there's a value exchange that needs to be understood between the two. I think this is my idea so far. So firstly, I think it's most obvious what the scientist gives to the designer in terms of their expertise. But more than that, they also give research skills. So like how to actually conduct experiments in the way that a scientist does, I think is really important for designers to learn. But what I want to say, because I'm assuming this is mostly a kind of scientists audience, is that designers have a lot to give to scientists as well. So firstly, the idea of new narratives, of kind of combining and permeating new thoughts, which can help bring about new ideas in the scientists, or collaborating on new ideas. One that we actually talked about last week was helping scientists communicate their work, and even helping themselves kind of understand where their work fits in a larger picture, and helping them communicate their work to different types of audiences, which again is, it talks about the incommensurability of language. Like, this is something designers and artists, we have to break down and build new kind of languages back up. And finally, cross-disciplinary knowledge, which is really like understanding that, oh, you have problem X, well, this industry also had that problem and it solved it through Y, or it addressed it through Y. And then finally, networks and facilities we can share between each other. And the facilities of a designer are often more about the people with which we can communicate, rather than simply equipment that we have. So yes, again, that's my main message: more collaboration, and thank you.
Samuel, thank you very much indeed. I haven't got any questions yet in the chat, but I've got a few things that you raise in your talk, which I just will pick up with you, and perhaps we'll get some more questions coming in here. You know, you talked about your urinal, and it's kind of contradictory in a way, because we actually have a shortage of fertilizers, and yet fertilizers are such a problem. And I suppose I might say to you, you know, what could you do at your level with that, where you might actually start using it more as a resource, recycling it as a resource?
So this is essentially, like, the idea was to use the mats as fertilizer after they were used. And so there are definitely issues in realistically doing it with the kind of system design of collecting all of these mats, and then things with the potential issues with pathogens.
Yeah.
But it was, I guess, what I would call a narrative device. Like, it was provoking ideas in people. But actually what I'm doing now at this residency is I continue to look at phosphorus pollution, and we're looking at new types of farming. So actually seaweed farming, but in these water bodies that have this nutrient pollution. And what's interesting there is that so anyone who's built a seaweed farm, it takes a lot of time and difficult legislation to do so, because effectively the entire coast of the UK, this is the UK I'm talking about, the entire coast is owned by the Crown, and you have to go through this process and pay money to do that. Rivers and lakes are not owned by the Crown, and there's virtually there's much less that you need to do. They're owned by private people, and it's basically trying to convince someone who has the lake or river, this is something I'm interested in doing. And then on the other side, the current methods for removing phosphorus from water bodies are pretty severe and not very ecologically friendly. So for example, iron doping, which doesn't actually even remove the phosphorus, it just temporarily makes it not available. This is a big problem.
It is.
Last thing.
Go on.
So there was a new report that said 0% of water bodies in the UK have considered good ecological status, and 75% of those are due to phosphorus pollution. So this is a big problem.
It's a really important statistic, and it seems to, in my lifetime, it seems to have gone from bad to better to worse again. I'm getting lots of questions coming in, but I'm just going to ask you one more, and we'll perhaps pick up these in the panel. How much seaweed is needed to make a kilo of glass? This is from Beth Anderson.
It depends what type of diatom you're using. Some of the shells, there can be a kind of order of magnitude difference between different species of algae as to the composition of silica in their shell. But it's a lot.
A lot. Yeah, that's good. I'm going to stop you there, but I'm going to put these other questions on my other list, and we'll pick them up in the panel, because there's some very interesting ones too about things you've
Thank you so much for letting me speak.
Thank you very much for another very inspiring talk, and we will come back to some of those ideas hopefully. Thank you very much. Okay, so we'll move on now to the next talk, which is by Alice Sharp. And Alice is the artistic director of Invisible Dust. And this is where artists and scientists can come together. It's a sort of agency where art and environment comes together. And Invisible Dust works with leading artists and scientists to produce work that explore environmental and climate change. So I think, Alice, over to you. Sorry, I've got 2 bits of paper here with different bits of information, but
that's fine.
You can explain what you do. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. Hello, very nice to meet you all. My name's Alice Sharp. I'm the artistic director of Invisible Dust, and thank you very much to Anushka and Sams for inviting me to this event. It's really interesting to hear the other types of artists, designers, all speaking about algae. My presentation is going to be a bit broader than algae. I work on a real range of art and science projects that look at climate change and our environment. And we've been working since 2009 on this area. So we've had a real sort of long track record of working. And I've worked over the years many times on ocean projects. So I'm very passionate about the oceans. And I think the thing that's really important about art and science is this bringing in of a very personal understanding to the science. It's quite difficult as a scientist to bring in things that move people, get them energized and sort of get going for action. And particularly with climate change, that's something that we're all very keen on doing, is getting people understanding how important the statistic that Samuel just gave us about, the pollution, for example, is a devastating statistic. But are people doing anything about it? Do they feel energized? Do they feel like they want to get on and do this? So the first thing to say is I'm going to look at why art and science is important, because I think a lot of people here are scientists, and I think it's really important to make those arguments for that. And then to look at a few of our projects. We've got a project which was quite near Oban actually, which was called Shore, How We See the Sea, where we work with two filmmakers. I've also got a project that's called Unnatural History, which is looking at natural history in museums. And finally, Wild Eye, which is a project in North Yorkshire we're working on. So I'll just start by sharing some slides, and I hope that everything works according to plan. We'll give it a go. So I'll start off with my presentation slide. Okay, so let's go into Invisible Dust. So Invisible Dust I started in 2009, and we've been working, as I say, since then on a lot of projects. And when I first started working with scientists, I worked with an air pollution scientist. And I want to give this example because I think it's quite interesting in terms of algae. Okay, this is an algae, but this is something very, very small that people can't see, but it's actually very, very significant. And so we worked with this scientist who was actually showing these images of Monet, of Turner, of the Thames, as part of his scientific presentations to show how air pollution changed from very visible air pollution in Victorian times to the invisible air pollution that there is now. And I don't know if you know, but people sit in their cars outside their children's playground, polluting away, and they found that the children's playgrounds are more polluted than the surrounding streets. So there's actions here that need to be addressed, which we're not realising because of this invisibility. And I think it's quite interesting making the link into the algae link. So the first few projects we did were about air pollution, and this is a project which is by an artist called Kasia Mulga. She designed this wearable, absolutely extraordinary wearable, which changes colour with air pollution. And although, again, it's not an algae project, I thought you might want to see a little glimpse of this because it does show the sort of things that artists can do with scientists. So Kasia worked with King's College scientists looking at how dangerous air pollution is, and this is what she came up with.
See these masks across the faces, they suddenly say to us, what's happening here? Is this something about the air?
It's like smoking, you know, we all know that it's bad. You just need to see how bad things actually are.
Art is not about being didactic, it's about kind of intriguing in order for a viewer to start asking more questions.
Art can connect people with science on a very human level. It aesthetically looks beautiful.
So just in terms of some of the technical things which people always ask me about with that project, there are sensors in the actual costumes, and those sensors change the colour of the costume. So as the dancers are walking along the street, when they hit the traffic lights, which is where air pollution levels go up, the costumes actually change colour with PM10 or NO2, one of the air pollution gases that are, making that problem. So my first point about art and science is we make the invisible visible. Something like algae is in our oceans, it's below that water surface. How do we get people to care about something so important to our planet? As started in the start of the conversation about our second breath is used. Every second breath by people is something that's created by algae. But do people, if you walk down the street and ask someone about algae, do they know about it? Do they understand it? Do they feel passionate about it? So that's the first point. I think the second point with this is that art is a universal language. And when you see a really amazing art piece like this piece by Kasia Mulga, whether you are in Taiwan, whether you're in Sydney, whether you're in India, people all understood. As soon as they saw those videos, they understood it was about air pollution and they understood the impact it was having on their lives. So there's something really, really important about reaching people with visual things that really create that universal language around the world. I think that's really, really important. And then finally, on the kind of art and science side, and this is a scientist that some people might know here, which is a marine biologist called Alex Rogers. And I've worked with him for many years, and he works a lot on the deep sea. And I just wanted to kind of say the third point is about value and how do we value things as human beings. Now, a lot of scientists are doing experiments here. I think Alex is just showing one of his amazing little creatures that he catches from the deep sea, which is amazing, but does that really get us moving? And I think what I wanted to say was I think that it's quite tricky because, if we talk about something like water pollution, which Samuel raised, we have this water pollution in our seas, and how do we actually, as human beings, relate to that? Well, if we look about economists, they might say, we're going to look at the cost of clearing up the oceans, and that's the statistic we're going to give you. If you're talking about scientists, they might talk about how much cubic amounts of that water would actually improve the plant life or improve the animal life in that. These are all really important statistics. They're all important in terms of going to research papers, but are you actually moved as a human being about that? And I would say that the great thing about the artworks is they can actually reach you. You can look at memories as a child of going to the seaside, the taste of the air when you go to the sea and you really taste that salt water. Things that are really emotional and connect to us as human beings can be explored through art. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of our projects. We did this project on a Danish science ship, which was part of a Copenhagen Science Festival. And these are videos of the deep sea we showed with Marina Neujacker right down in the hold of the boat. Another project by Saskia Old-Welbers looking at oil pollution in Greece. And another final project on these set of projects on oceans, we worked with amazing writer China Myville. And China said to me, what I really want to do is I really want to go into the deep sea and go out of the light level. And thankfully, we were able to do it. So Alex Rogers was part of a Necton research trip, and China actually went down in this submersible below the light level and had that incredible experience, which he turned into an essay, which we then shared at an exhibition which had 400,000 people at it. So there are ways of this really important science getting out there to the public and really having this impact. But also you can see just from the image, it's just fascinating understanding what's going on between art and science. So the second project I wanted to mention was one which is called Unnatural History. And at the start, Nick was talking about the importance of the Challenger voyage and that it took an artist on that. And that is part of a tradition that went right back to, people like Cook and the really early explorers. And our exhibition was looking at a number of issues to do with that. This first piece is something about climate change. The head is actually a globe, and it's about metamorphosis. And I think with climate change, it's really important to be hopeful. I think it's really important to inspire hope in people. And I think this piece really did that. And we were making the connection in this exhibition about natural history of the role of artists, but also the importance of natural history to climate change. And so this second piece was about that whole voyages, the voyages that Cook and other people went out. This particular piece is about that voyage. And he took Sidney Parkinson, who's the incredible illustrator people might have heard of, and Joseph Banks, who's a really important botanist at the time, on those voyages to do that scientific studying. But also the people they met, the Pacific Islanders on the right, had their own cultures, had their own artistic artworks. And so this kind of really interesting exchange that went there. I mean, obviously, part of it is controversial in terms of the way that colonialism has resulted from that. But I think the actual kind of interesting things that can be explored from this can really highlight the importance of working between art and science. And so coming on to the more local project, which we did near Oban, which was started on the Isle of Arran and then went to other parts of the Western Scotland, we worked with two amazing artists. So this first artist is Margaret Salmon, and she just makes the most beautiful films. And this is an image from Sam's laboratory. So she worked with scientists to access some of these amazing images. And she also used some sounds from Sam's in her film. And she just made this wonderful film, which was connections between the local communities and the sea. It was just a really wonderful thing. And then the second film was Edwin Ingalls, and he worked with communities in Arran and really did amazing works. And so I'm going to just give you a little glimpse of the project. Hopefully this is all going to work well. And straight into there. Okay, yeah, that's all looking good. Okay, so just give you a bit of insight into that project.
Edward Ingle works in a way where he is a community filmmaker and he brings the opinion of local people into a film. So the way he shapes and themes his work is that he brings that community voice.
Oh yes.
Oh, it's in the shell.
It's in the shell. It's gone to hide. It's gone for safety.
The film is all about asking questions and conversations. I thought the people in the film asked questions of the sea, and I love thinking of the sea as a character. And at the end of my film, 3 of the questions that came up in the film are then asked back to the audience. How do you use the sea? Who owns the sea? And how do you protect the sea? And I think those are 3 things I think that everyone can think about are quite relatable, but also the things that came up throughout the project people kind of would return to.
How do you use the sea?
How do you use the sea?
Position. Oh yeah, swimmers is good.
Divers.
Well, as in swimming, as in looking at it, as in enjoying it, as in looking at the birds, the ducks, the wildlife.
Essentially, you could call the film a sound poem, and so for me, in making the work, listening was as important as looking. And so, in a way, it presents a cacophony of rhythms and voices, both above and below the water. So it was quite a joyous, fun experience for me. Translating sort of scientific phenomena through moving image, and then, you know, understanding that there's factual information, but there's also great beauty and imagination that's involved in you know, experiencing these things.
You don't need to be.
So that was a really fantastic opportunity to work with local people in Scotland, and the two films, the first one by Ed, who worked very closely with the communities, the one where you can see everybody around the table with the workshop and it says, how do you use the sea? That was actually part of his film. So his film was of the process of working with local communities. And then the second film, which is a much more sort of ethereal film, which goes into the deep, into the underwater, as well as filming local people. And that voice actually was a local choir that sang alongside the film. So she actually, local people were involved in the sounds of the film. And so that was a fantastic opportunity to work on both of those things. And the film toured, and we took it to about 10 locations, including all the islands like Barra, North Uist and Skye, and then took it right up, and it ended up in Edinburgh. So we had this really wonderful thing where we were asking local people about their opinions about the marine protected areas, and we would take the conversation from one thing to another. So that was quite a unique part of the project. We were actually enabling local people to speak to each other. So the final project, which I'll be quite brief with, because I know we've got a lot of speakers today, is just a project we're just starting in North Yorkshire. So we've developed a project called Wildeye, and we're working with Yorkshire Wildlife Trust. And I think the thing that's interesting here is we're bringing in an idea about tourism, as well as working with local communities. And so what we're doing is we're developing local structures where people can actually go and view nature and look out from things like the Castle Headland. Sculptures being built there at the moment, which people can sit on and look out at the porpoises and the dolphins. We're going to work with a local seaweed farm, which is obviously much more relevant to what we're talking about today, and that's the next couple of years, and we just got the funding awarded for it, which is fantastic. And I think the important thing there is a lot of these seaside places are known as bucket and spade places, but actually they've got the most amazing nature. And I didn't know until quite recently that they have dolphins in here in Scarborough. So I'm just going to show you a really brief little bit of film, which is of local young people we've been working with a sound artist who've actually been using hydrophones to record the local sea life as part of the project. So I'll just quickly show you.
And then yesterday happened, and the exciting thing was, yes, there have been some dolphins spotted going north, and you could see these really big splashes in the water, and they were coming right out of the water and sort of flopping in, and then they came right towards the boat and they went across our bow, slopped the hydrophones in, and we could hear them communicating.
So that opportunity to actually go on a boat and look and record dolphins was just absolutely amazing for the local young people. There's not anything that they'd had that experience. Most of them hadn't been on a boat. Most of them hadn't actually had that experience of seeing a dolphin, and then thirdly recording a dolphin. So it was a really unique, and as you can see, a very moving experience for the local young people there. So that's some of the things that we want to do as part of Wild Eye, to bring people realising that North Yorkshire is a place which does have whales and dolphins, is something that's got, you know, a seaweed farm and those kind of things. So I'm very pleased to take any questions about the art and science or the projects that we've just been talking about, and do feel free to follow us on Twitter and Instagram and that kind of thing. But yes, Juliet, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Another very inspirational, very much to my heart. I'm fascinated by soundscapes and how they vary, and I was really lucky. I was in the South Atlantic working of South Georgia, and I was able to actually, you know, record whales and things like that, and, you know, things I'd never heard before, which it is very moving. And I like that, you know, it's about trying to get people inspired by what they see rather than being hit over the head all the time about all the doom and gloom. We obviously have to address all of that, but it's also something very magical. But I'm going to there's one question for you, and that I'll ask you now, but hopefully there's a little bit more time afterwards. So Alice, this is a question from from Anushka, actually. Is it harder to get folk interested in algae than in other marine issues, would you say?
Oh yes, me and Anushka have chatted for quite a long time about that. Yes, we actually did a festival 2022, which I don't know if you've heard about that, but it's been launched just the start of this year, a festival sort of project, and we decided to do it about algae. And Anushka was saying to me, well, I don't know if it's going to work because it's about algae. Actually, I think we put forward a really great project. Unfortunately, we weren't selected, but I don't think that there is a problem with algae. I just think it's being imaginative is what I'd say. And I think there's a really wonderful kind of sense that actually the scientists are as imaginative as the artists. And I think that's something I would really like to sort of, you know, champion. I think sometimes people think that it's the artist coming in with all the imagination. Actually, you know, there's a wonderful William Blake quote, which says, once proven, now proven, once imagined. And actually, you know, to do science, you have to have imagination. So I think it's a really important point of sort of bringing artists and scientists together. So I just think it's about being an imaginative with algae. Yeah. And I think it's just, it has got this, as you pointed out in your introduction, Julia, it is beautiful, as well as having all this incredible, important role as a carbon sink and all the amazing things that people are showing already in these presentations that people are doing with it. So I just think it's about being imaginative, and as you say, reaching people on a personal level is really important.
Yes, it is, and science is an art. There's no doubt about it. And sometimes I think it's a bit of a dark art, but I think that's great to think of it like that. And absolutely, you have to be creative, you know, in all these fields.
Yes.
Thank you so much. That's another really wonderful talk. And I hate to cut people off, but I'm going to go to our last speaker. I think that's correct. Yes. And this is Miek Zwamborn. I hope I've pronounced that right, Miek. And you're a Dutch author, visual artist and curator, and you co-run, which sounds a wonderful place, Nok Bologon, on the Isle of Mull. So this is described as a remote refuge for art, literature, research, and natural preservation, which sounds absolutely wonderful. So over to you, Miek.
Thank you, Juliet, for your introduction. I'm very pleased that I can join today. Thank you very much for the invitation and also for your inspirational presentations, Anna, Jessica, Samuel, and Alice. Let's see if I can move my own slides now. It's not work yet. Yeah, I think I need some help from Open, but yeah. In these challenging times, it feels urgent to find new ways and places for works of art and makers. There's often this discrepancy between creating a work and its purpose after being presented. Therefore, I would love to share some thoughts about the way artworks can be embedded in culture. I'm not exaggerating if I say that seaweed has shaped my practice since I moved to the Isle of Mull 6 years ago. Coming from the Netherlands with a deep interest in poetry and genius loci, and history, I suddenly found myself between weather-beaten and tidal-balanced worlds. Although I was used to be surrounded by water and wetlands, I could not capture my new environment in any language. Living near the ocean and exploring the fluid matrix that is water has transformed me from an autonomous maker into a collaborator. Questions like how to share work, for who would you make it, and why became much more relevant than before. For me, making art and writing poetry is all about tentacular exploring and building relationships. Next slide, please. In this talk, I would like to tell about a few collaborations, starting with Entangled, that I developed with Wouter Engelbart from Platform Dis, sound artist Herman van den Muizenberg, and agri-ecologist Willem Brandenberg. This project developed from the question, which interaction exists and can arise between seaweed and other communities? As we had to work from distance because of the pandemic, our correspondence grew first into a blog and then a podcast series. For every episode, we invited guest speakers. The more we learned from the different perspectives on seaweed, the more we felt the need of sharing our findings and concerns about the growing seaweed industry. We have to be extremely careful with producing seaweed products and arts to build up a long-lasting bond. That awareness made us write the Seaweed Manifesto, a document in which we try to formulate our excitement about the range of seaweed possibilities beside the roles that we can and have to play. This manifesto dethrones the human ego from the heart of the pluriverse. We find ourselves at an ecological tipping point, and seaweed is one of the organisms that can help society develop new, necessary, reinforcing sustainable connections and restoring fractured ones. We will hand over this document upcoming spring to Frans Timmermans, the Executive Vice President responsible for Green Deal and climate law of the European Union. And we imagine it to be a ritual performance and are now designing and making costumes that we will wear during the procession through Brussels. If you are interested in our manifesto, you can find it on my website. Next slide, please. In the Verstrengels podcast series, we create a virtual landscape by sound sculptures, interviews, poems, and seaweed determination in the hope to create an algal interest for a broader audience. Next slide, please. In search of a sparkling language, we approached Piet de Vos, a Belgium-based blind writer and literary theorist. He had never met algae before and was willing to explore a collection of seaweed from the Bay of Noordwolligen that I cut, dried, and posted to him. Next slide. I labeled the species with a small grey board's geometric shapes, so we could keep track of them with this simple key. Next slide. Pete's sensorial research into both dry and wet seaweed resulted in a beautiful essay exploring different skins, form, absorption, and cooperation. At the moment, Herman is composing a seaweed hymn for Verstrengeld number 4, and next summer we will organize the first Dutch seaweed festival in Zeeland, together with a bunch of enthusiastic artists and scientists. Next, please. Algae belong to the most sensual family in the plant kingdom. I tried to mirror how they swish and sway in my handbook. I'm fascinated by how over time mankind has translated nature by exploring and experiencing with the senses. Next slide, please. Physical experience has been often the starting point of practice and theory in both art and science. Diving into the art history of seaweed, I discovered so many beautiful works from all over the planet through all times. Next one, please. And I started to arrange them without a center via a rhizomatic structure to create a meandering encyclopedia in which hierarchy does not exist. Next one, please. But without overly compelling chronology on thematic organization, I strung together historical facts, anecdotes, biographical fragments, recipes, scientific research, and works of art. Next one. I wanted everything to flow. No, this is the right one. I wanted everything to flow into one another where the reader could swim through. Nance Shepherd writes in The Living Mountain that repetition forged her bond with the landscape. Man's experience enlarges rock, flower, and bird. The thing to be known grows with the knowing. That is so very true. Returning, returning, and returning once again, I started to distinguish between the different colonies in the bays and get to recognize individual seaweed and its inhabitants. Next one, please. Coming across some daberlocks, which have a distinct midrib, a wonderful legend comes in mind. Strength and flexibility of the sea palm were highly valued by the indigenous people of the Pacific Northwest coast. In ancient times, some Pedada, people of the sea foam, where they called, made a salve from the stipes of the brown seaweed by drying them in the summer, then burning them, powdering the charcoal and mixing it with raccoon bone marrow. Newborn babies would have their backbone rubbed with a charcoal from the burned sea palm to make them resilient and tough as the sea palm itself, which is able to withstand the continuous pounding of the open North Pacific surf. Next one, please. To me, books are very important sources for inspiration and objects to meet and connect with people. Next one, please. During the compilation of my book, other collaborations emerged. Next slide, please. Together with my partner Rutger Emmelkamp, I founded a study place for art, literature, field research, nature preservation, and a permaculture garden on the most southern tip of the Isle of Mull, called Nokvolgen. Next slide, please. Yeah, and the next one as well, please. Together with our guest makers, we learn practices of attunement through which we start to sense local dynamics. We stimulate encounters between our residents and islanders and organize cultural events for the local community, like workshops, poetry readings, book presentations, concerts, film screenings, and meals. Next one, please. We also aim to develop new rituals. A Scots myth tells that on the day of St. Columba, at nighttime, people from Lewis poured libations and invoked the sea deity Johnny to ensure the health and so good harvest of seaweed. Next slide, please. In the Japanese city of Kitayushu, in the province of Fukuoka, a seaweed ritual has been performed for centuries. Next one, please. On the first day of the new year, at sunrise, 3 priests walk into the icy water to cut seaweed at the mercy of the currents and the tide, and with only a torch to light their way. The freshly picked wakame, the first of the year, is offered to the gods of the Mekari altar. Next slide, please. In the past, the Makari ceremony was performed in secret. You can witness it, but now you can witness it from afar. Next slide, please. I believe, to end my talk, I believe that artistic research and collaborative art would help us to bring the sea and its seaweed as a very precious organism closer to people's occupied lives. Next slide, please. If we find the right words and visual translations, we could contribute to the well-being of these astonishing life-producing bodies and enrich art, the art world, and literature. Next slide, please. And thank you.
Neat. Thank you very much indeed. That was another very, very different and inspiring talk. And, you know, showing Japan reminded me of Kathleen Drew, who discovered the life history of Porphyra. And, you know, there's the annual ceremony there of the fishermen to Kathleen Drew. And you know, this idea of the rituals, the new rituals and that sort of thing. And again, another very different concept, but some very beautiful pictures. Thank you very, very much indeed. And there's a question. Actually, it's more sort of like, people are very keen to see the Seaweed Manifesto. I don't know whether we can put something in the Q&A with a link. Is that possible? Do you think could somebody do that if they have the link to it? If not,
I think so.
Yeah, can we do that? And then I've got another quick question here, which again, we'll probably pick up. We'll pick up a little bit different. So this is from Mikey. What challenges and opportunities does living on Mull have for your practice? I guess that's a huge question, but if you can answer that in about 30 seconds, it would be brilliant.
Yeah, well, I put the slide of this pile of seaweed in between this slideshow, because creating is like writing and creating and collaborating with the people is the same important here now as looking after the garden and repairing things and rescuing pieces that are flying away because of the gales. There's no hierarchy there as well, which is really very, very different than working in a city in a very silent studio. And I think in a way it really triggered something in me that was needed, or something, another source of other way of being more spontaneous and being more loose and open for unexpected wonders or unexpected situations. But often also quite tough to be again called by all other duties and things to first do than to focus on other.
Quite a lot of survival, I imagine, at times as well, in that sense.
Yeah, and keeping yourself warm and feeding yourself, right?
Yes.
Yeah, no, that's true.
But it does sort of highlight too the value of, you know, being able to exchange, doing, you know, art placements and exchange and so on. That's really wonderful. I think that's all the questions I've got for you at the moment, but thank you so much for that. And I think at this point, thank you to all the speakers. They've all been different. They've all been very inspirational. But they've also raised a number of themes. And so this leaves us now with about 20 minutes or so for the panel. And I'm going to move on to that. And I just want to introduce you to the panel at this point. So on the panel, we've got 3 people plus all the speakers. So we've got Scott Donaldson, who is a leader in film education in Scotland, and he's head of film education at Screen Scotland, I think that's right, and is responsible for Creative Scotland's address to climate change. So that's Scott. So hello, Scott. We've got Alice, who you already know, and to join, and Julie Platt, and Julie, who is the head of development at SAMS. So she brings experience as a fundraiser specialist, particularly supporting scientists and conservationists, and I think probably much more. That is relatively new to SAMS, but bringing all that sort of wealth of experience. So I think at this point, again, put questions in the chat. I have some questions which actually will probably take up quite a lot of the time. And just one other thing I wanted to pick up on some of the speakers was language was raised. And I think that's something we should think about for if we sort of develop a workshop. It's something we struggle with in our science, yet alone in science and art, but yet it's so crucial. And I was just thinking too, in my seaweed song, another problem with language is that the taxonomy changes. So the seaweed song is now taxonomically out of date and things like that, which is, you know, it's probably quite funny in a way, but language is so important with how we communicate. So I'm going to move on to the questions, and I'm going to start. And again, if whoever wants to answer this, perhaps if you just put your hand up or something, or break in from the panel. So the first question is, in your experience, what are the key ingredients to successful collaborations between scientists and artists? So would one of you like to begin? I mean, maybe Scott, would you like to say something about that, as you haven't spoken yet?
Sure, sure, I'll go ahead. Just to be clear, though, about my responsibilities, yes, I've been active on the kind of environmental side of Creative Scotland's activities, but I'm not responsible for them. That would be that would be assuming too much.
It says that on the website. So
does it? Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
Fair cop. Okay. I don't know. I'm not sure I can answer that. I think Alice probably is going to be better able to kind of answer that question. A related question, I suppose, or a prior question to that is what's the purpose of what you're doing? What is the purpose of the art-science collaboration? Just to kind of illustrate that a wee bit, back in the day, which is when I first started working with SAMS, I was looking after I was asked to look after a residency program for an artist residency program, and seeing that as a kind of talent development process of learning, and believing very much that learning is a collaborative process. Some of the projects we funded were about placing artists in scientific contexts. SAMS, for example, was one of the projects, and that, so that the motivation, I suppose, for that program was talent development for artists. There's also a long time ago, 2013, Scotland had its its Year of Natural Scotland. You may remember that the Scottish government used to have, still does, I think, have these kind of year ofs. And the Year of Natural Scotland was in 2013. We set up a big project, artist science project. There's about 15 projects, I think, funded out of that, where artists and scientists got together to look at this concept of natural Scotland. The project was called Imagining Natural Scotland. There's stuff still on a website. And the idea there, I suppose, was to sort of kind of question the kind of lochs and glens image of Scotland. I suppose I was quite exercised about the misperception of Scotland as this kind of place of natural beauty, which of course it is, but the way that so much of it had been exhausted and depleted by centuries past. So, there are different kinds of purposes. People in the talk have talked a lot about public engagement and public learning, about the learning of scientists and so forth. So I think, think first about what the project is for. What are you trying to achieve through it? Is it about making beautiful things, for example? And Jessica's work does both of those things. It makes beautiful things, but it's also about public education.
I think that's a very good point, Scott, that the sort of the thrust behind it all needs to be sort of well thought through in many ways, I suppose. Although I suppose one might be able to argue that might come secondarily from something beautiful. I don't know, Alice, would you like to sort of come in and...
Yeah. No, delighted to, thank you. I think Scott's absolutely right. The first thing is to be very clear about aims, and sometimes that process takes a bit of time, is what I'd say. So when an artist starts working with a scientist, I think the first thing is to say that there's a kind of research phase itself in the development of the project, because it may be that the artist has got one idea and the scientist has got a completely different idea about what the artist is going to be doing. So I think that first stage of actually talking through where you want to go with something is really, really vital to any art science collaboration. And I think part of it is that word that you said, Juliet, which I also put in my presentation, is language, because everybody has their language. Even within the scientists, everyone is so specialized in science. You know, I imagine in algae, there's probably like loads of different types of scientists that are studying algae just on its own. And so even within science, people are used to different languages and different bodies that they reference and different organizations. So I think that joint language and ensuring that everybody understands is really important. There's other things. I think a lot of scientists are based in universities or larger organizations, and by their nature, most artists or designers are freelance. And so there's a little bit of an inequality there. And I think it's really, really important, first of all, to establish that you always pay the artists. So even if they're doing research work with you, even if they're just developing a project, don't expect an artist who's a freelancer and doesn't have any other income to spend a lot of time developing something. So I'm very passionate about ensuring that artists are paid for their work, even at the research stages of this. And the other thing that's quite interesting about universities now is not only are the universities thankfully addressing climate and being focused on climate, but they're also very interested in interdisciplinary working. And I think that's another part that's quite interesting between working with artists and scientists, is you have that individual relationship between an artist and scientist, but you might also have somewhere further up in the organisation of a university, sometimes going right up to the sort of vice chancellor level, where they're really interested in the idea of people bringing together both art and science. And there may be opportunities to involve other sort of postdocs or other students from different faculties together as part of your project, if you're doing an art and science project, as well as the actual relationship that you have. And we've been doing quite a lot of work with universities where we're looking at that and looking at opportunities for scientists and artists, students or PhD researchers to actually understand more about each other's work, because it actually helps you as a scientist. And it's very interesting to you as an artist to actually understand the other person's point of view. And I think that's a really important part of it. And I guess it's just being very, very open to new ways of seeing something. It's quite interesting for me that some scientists, I approach them, and at the start they can be quite hostile to the idea of working with an artist, but they can sometimes be the most keen person once they realise what's involved, and they can turn completely. So I think it's really interesting, that kind of whether people tend to say, okay, I'm the public engagement type of scientist, and I'm not, but actually some of the really kind of key researchers I found really, really, really interesting in terms of working with. And we did a project which the other thing I think is to say is that obviously art and science projects work at different levels. You have some which might be very, very light touch, and the scientists might just meet the artists a couple of times, and then you have other ones that are much more embedded. And we worked with an artist with the Natural History Museum and the Kew Gardens, and she actually had the scientist in her film as part of her artwork. So that's when they're really embedded, because the scientist is actually in the work. Other times they're just feeding in a bit of research or a bit of ideas about things. So I think that's the other thing, because I think a lot of people worry about it taking up a lot of their time and they're already very busy and all those kind of things. But it can actually be quite a light touch thing. It doesn't always have to be something where you're spending a huge amount of time on it. So I think that's a good thing to know.
That's great, Alice. I think this business of buy-in from your institution at the high level is important too, because it's a bit like any science. You make collaborations with the people you get on with to a large extent, and those are the things that work or have longevity. And I guess that's going to be the same with the artist. But if you can get more of a buy-in from your institution, you then have something more concrete that you can work with in the longer term. And you've actually really sort of covered a couple of questions there, actually, and the idea of potential. No, it's great. And I want to bring in Julie actually at this point, because you're probably coming in from the sort of more, I was thinking like the more down on the ground, feet on the ground, things cost money, which of course, Alice, people cost money. You've raised that too. So Julie, do you want to come in at this point?
Yeah, well, I was going to say, well, I'm an artist sort of born and bred, really, and a professional fundraiser by trade. So I've often been a kind of, you know, the middleman in between a lot of these projects. And some of them have gone absolutely smoothly and swimmingly. Some of them have been a bit more challenging, and often the person in the middle can kind of help with some of those things. And going back to your original question about the kind of key ingredients, for me, I definitely think the ones that end up being the most successful collaborations tend to be ones where there is mutual respect, there's communications and ongoing communications, and a real kind of sense of trust. And that comes with continuing to communicate, can build up that trust. But I think what's really key, and particularly when it comes to funding, is around knowing what the appetite for risk is, what people's parameters are, bearing in mind that both artists and scientists, they're hugely, kind of protective, and rightly so, about their work and the quality and the credibility, making sure that people are on the same page when it comes to looking at who's going to fund it, who's going to support it, particularly when it comes to sponsors. I think that's a really, really key thing. So I think it's kind of like what Alice said, really, that planning stage is really important, knowing where everybody sits and where everybody stands, and you know, that needs to be done in the first instance. And you know, I think funders can really tell when that's been done and when it hasn't been done.
I wonder if too here, this is somewhere where, you know, as a researcher, as researchers, we're fairly used to writing. It's our job to write research grants and research money. And again, where there's a kind of reciprocal thing here where we can feed each other with our different skills to actually make these things happen, perhaps, you know, which might be another angle to that.
I think the different language that we've, the thing that we brought up about that there are different languages within the professions, is really kind of crucial as well, because actually depending on what kind of funding you want to go for, will actually depend on who kind of puts those bids together, who writes them, who pitches them, and different people will do that depending on who it is that you want to go and apply to funding from.
So it's another very good point. Yeah, yes, Alice. So then I want to
I just
bring in
wanted to ask Scott a question,
Samuel.
actually, because what is Creative Scotland's general attitude to applicants about art and science to support those sort of projects? Is there an interest, and have you supported any recently?
You're mute, Scott, if you could unmute yourself. Yeah.
Those kind of projects, I guess, Alice, would normally come into our open fund.
Right.
I had nothing to do with the open fund for years, so I can't really answer.
Yeah.
But maybe I could throw up the 1.5 project, which we funded out of our film education fund, because that's my core business, film education. So we funded a program for people across Scotland to make 90-second films about climate change with COP in mind last year. And the big chunk of that funding was to support training for people all across Scotland to be able to make those 90-second films using mobile devices. So we were trying to get as many people engaged in the project through professional development, basically. And that was a partnership with others, SAMS was involved, and Keep Scotland Beautiful was involved, so we have climate change partner involved in it. So in general, I would say we are, Creative Scotland is very interested in art science. We funded a whole load of it over many years. One of the things here to sort of think about is I think art and science it's quite easy actually to put those together. The point's been made several times by several speakers that the kind of creativity that's involved in both art and science fit together quite nicely. They're both engaged with beauty in different ways, and putting the art and the science together. What is kind of wonderful about what can be really wonderful about science and art and science together is when you kind of create that sense of awe and wonder. I like the word numinous, the numinous. I don't know if any of you know that word, but that kind of sense of spirituality that art and science both and together can create. And I think that's one of the key things that, you know, we all need to be working for, you know, from a kind of public education perspective, to change people's perspective of the awful situation that we're in. But as I say, art and science go very well together. I thought a lot when I was looking after those residency programs a long time ago now, about, okay, so but where's the problem? Actually, the problem's not with the science. The science is telling us what's going on, you know, in terms of climate change and ocean acidification and all of that. It's the economy, it's policy that's the problem. Should we not be putting artists together with policy and you know, economy? Somebody, I made a note here. Yeah, Meek was talking about intervening in policy with the Seaweed Manifesto. That's really interesting. So yeah, I mean, in terms of art science collaboration, I don't really see a problem. If you put art science collaboration into Google, you'll find loads of examples. You know, you've got ASCUS and the Focus Group. Is it Focus in Edinburgh? Just as a for example. I don't know if you guys know about ASCUS. I can put stuff in the chat. I'll put some links in the chat. We co-sponsored with Royal Scottish Geographical Society one of their climate summits, which was about climate emergency and culture. What is culture's role in addressing this? There's we sponsored a film with a lot of other national bodies. Climate Action Needs Culture. Again, I can put a link in the chat. But this challenge to artistic activity and cultural activity, particularly publicly funded cultural activity of the kind that we, you know, that's what we're here for. It's a big challenge to all of that activity, to be thinking about the world that we live in and just how troubling it is. So how are you going to address that? What are you going to do about that?
I think, Scott, this is really the sort of heart of the issue. I mean, one of the things we've been doing quite a lot in science now is we've around the world with our groups is writing policy briefs, and I don't see why we can't do the same thing with the sort of combined art science to sort of put that information all together. I probably need some working up, but I think you raised some really, really interesting points. And, you know, this idea of perhaps something that's numinous, which can be very appealing, but also something that is more than the sum of the parts, I guess, too. What I want to do, I'm conscious of time. You've covered a lot of the questions that have come in sort of different ways. I want to just go back to Samuel because, and it sort of touches on some of the things you've been talking about, Scott, particularly, but Samuel, as a designer, I mean, how do you go about approaching scientific partners to collaborate? You know, how do you do it, say, in your field where you're thinking of design, you're thinking, I guess, of ergonomics and things like that? And perhaps a personal approach to that, and then we'll move back onto some of the more practical things.
Yeah, I guess I would say you need to do your research first, and you need to. So I was talking about this process of kind of sacrificial ideas, and like it's in a sense it's a way of coming to the table with something rather than just completely being extractive and just taking information from an expert. And I think maybe what I didn't say as well is like that they might be sacrificial ideas, but it takes a lot of you reading through information to kind of generate these ideas. And you need to, well, part of the purpose of them is that the expert that you're talking to might give information that they didn't think was worth talking about or was already obvious, and it might help, or on the other side, it might help kind of kickstart a completely new type of thinking that they just hadn't considered. So for one example, I was talking to this guy, Paul Withers, who's the head of Refocus in the UK, which is a project looking at how we can make phosphorus use circular rather than linear, which it is at the moment in the UK. And I was saying to him, what do you think we need to do about like phosphorus pollution going to rivers? And he essentially said, we just need to stop people using as much. There's nothing you can do. But he had also said that there's a legacy piece, so there's 100 years of this stuff that will keep going into rivers. So through talking to him about this, and then also proposing the idea of a farm that can help remove some of this phosphorus by growing, I helped him, and I'm not trying to make him sound like an idiot or anything, but I helped him realize that just saying we need to reduce the amount is not enough. Like, we already know that the water bodies, which are sinks for phosphorus, it needs to be removed from them. It's kind of like the great garbage pickup with plastic. Like, even if we stop any plastic going in right now into the oceans, there's still tons of it that we need to get out.
Right. Thank you very much for that, Samuel. I think we've got Jessica wants to come in, and then I think I'm probably going to have to wind up, but so because I know people have sort of got to go. But Jessica, if you could come in fairly briefly at this point.
Thank you, Juliet. I just want to come back to Scott, because what Scott was saying is very important. And I think this is something that it could be useful for everyone, which is the idea of building a bridge between scientists and research institutions, society, and policymakers. And I think that by starting when we create beautiful things and beautiful art, you ignite the sense of awe. But then, you have an emotional reaction when you see beauty, when you have that aesthetics, but then what do you do with that? How do you add further value to it? And I think that is when the content, the education, for example, we create these booklets that are fact-based. So we work with the scientists, and then when they purchase a scarf, for example, they get a booklet with all the science content, and then something else that is also important is the economics, so that we say, how can we bring more money back to science? At the moment, we are a small business, so it's the main value that we add is the sharing ocean literacy and revealing the unseen beauty of the planet and the ocean. But also the idea is so where people can also, we are trying to do fundraising for SAMS, for example, and our other partners. We offer that 10% of our profits go back to the research institutions, and we encourage our customers to directly give money to SAMS or the partners that work with us in the different collections. Something that we experienced recently when we showcased the new climate change collection at COP26 at Dynamic Earth, I was approached by two representatives for the Scottish government, and they asked us to use this climate change booklet as unofficial policy briefings. And I think this is a great thing, because it's something that is an icebreaker. You see beautiful pictures and art, but also you can read about the science. And I think it's about that, it's creating that emotional reaction, but also activating the educational, the more cognitive response, and having a holistic approach to it. And then also understanding how to make it sustainable long-term. And that's why I think that scalability is important, because when you bring money both ways, you give out into the community, into society, but you also bring money back to science. I think that it can secure the long-term success of such projects.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very good point. Right. I am going to stop at this point. I'm conscious there's a great deal more we could chat about. And I think that, I mentioned at the beginning that there seems to be a good desire to continue this discussion, to set up a working group, to see perhaps where we can go in the future. So as I mentioned, you'll have the opportunity to say whether you're interested in that. And thanks very much to Scott for all the information that he's put into the chat or into the Q&A on links. That's fantastic. And so I think really, I'm going to bring this to a close now and to say that I think this is just the start of something very exciting. And just to round up, I want to give a huge thanks to all our speakers, to our keynote speaker, to the speakers. I think everybody will agree it's an absolutely fantastically inspiring set of talks, and there's such a lot to think about and such a lot that we can do. And I also want to thank all the people for coming along. I think at one point we had about 133 people, which is really fantastic, the interest that it's generated. And lastly, I want to thank the people that have put this together. So Michael Ross, who's organized the program and organization, Anushka Miller, the program, Beth Anderson, program resources, Richard Dale for the technical support, and for SAMS for hosting it. So a very big thank you to everybody, and hopefully this will be the start of something very exciting. And thank you all very much for coming.